Hi, welcome back, everyone. It's Lue Toma again. So this will be our last session for today's event. The speakers we have are John Falkowski and Seth Hyatt from Santa Clara County Parks. John Falkowski leads the GIS team at County Parks, where he has managed GIS for the past 21 years. Previously, he worked at Stanford University in the Maps and Records Division, responsible for guide map maintenance and mapping of campus infrastructure. Seth Hyatt is a GIS analyst at Santa Clara County Parks and Recreation Department, where he provides staff and the public with maps and web services to support decision-making for recreation, safety, planning, and infrastructure maintenance. Prior to joining the county, he has served as a GIS analyst for the Earth Science Division at NASA Ames Research Center and as Associate Director for the San Francisco State University Institute for Geographic Information Science. Seth has taught GIS at Foothill Community College and continues to teach GIS a few weekends each year at San Francisco State College of Extended Learning. Thank you, gentlemen, both, and we'll let you go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you. So today, John and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been able to discover using the recently acquired Lidar data here in the county within the parks, things that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to see without it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of what LiDAR is and a little bit of the history of terrain mapping so that we have some context for the kinds of things that John's going to be talking about. So next slide here. Okay. So I'll start with a quote by John Wesley Powell from about somewhere in the late 1800s. He said, "A government cannot do any scientific work of more value to the people at large than by causing the construction of proper topographic maps of the country." And so I think that maybe most of the people in this audience might appreciate that. Maybe not everybody agrees, but here on the right-hand side, we see a USGS quadrangle, a topographic map, that if you were a parks planner or somebody else, real estate or some other division at parks, working on a project trying to map something, this is what you would have used. It was essentially the extent of their geographic mapping, their GIS, right? With some serious limitations. In maybe the 80s and early 90s, the USGS started to take these maps and other sources of information and turn them into digital elevation models, these DEMs. So basically, they would take the contours that you see, and again, other sources of information, and they would interpolate them and turn them into gridded data, where, like we see here in the lower left-hand corner, each cell represents an elevation, and these cells are probably approximately 10 meters, depending on which version of the DEM you're looking at. So some of the issues with those were there were accuracy issues in the elevations themselves, and there were problems with the fact that they were not continuous. So if you wanted to do some GIS mapping with those, you would have to take maybe one or several of them and then stitch them together, and you'd end up with problems with seams and various other issues. Around the year 2000, there was the Shuttle Radar Topography mission, and that was basically the NASA shuttle going through and using radar to map elevation. And the product was not that different than the USGS DEMs that we had before, except for the data were continuous, right? So we didn't have this issue with the seams, and there were some improvements with the elevation accuracy. But still, we had this problem of resolution, and you can see here in the center we have an example of this product. And again, it's a similar resolution to the DEM, about 10 meters across for each of these pixel cells. And if we compare that to the image on the right-hand side, you can see that the channel here, there's a stream channel here that's represented kind of clear to see in the DEM or in the SRTM image. But what we don't see are other features in the map, like the road and so on. So these data are extremely helpful for looking at slope and for the kinds of things we do at parks, for looking at, doing things like trail planning and other kinds of planning, but certainly limited in the type of information that we can get from them. So, as I said, radar has been used for elevation mapping and certainly a lot of surveying. Recently, in the past couple decades, Lidar has become both affordable and technologically possible. So what is Lidar? It's similar to radar, and then basically it's an active form of remote sensing where a pulse is sent out, and then based on the timing of it coming back, we can get an idea of distance, right? So if we look here at the image on the left-hand side, a laser pulse is sent down, and that laser will hit the whatever surface and bounce back up to the sensor that's either going to be on a satellite or an airplane or any number of devices. If you have a fairly recent iPhone, you've got a little LiDAR sensor next to the camera. It's a little black dot. And of course, we use LiDAR for self-driving vehicles and so on. So in any case here, if we're looking at this image here, the laser pulse comes down, hits the ground as the last return, but on the way down, it may get interrupted by vegetation or other objects on the Earth's surface, in which case there are multiple returns. There's a first return, a second, however many, and then you have the last return. So if we look over here on the right-hand side, you can see that this is a bare ground model of the surface of the Earth based on that last return. The image above it is sort of it's basically the same thing, but they've taken the other returns and basically sort of built the canopy over on top of the bare Earth, so you can get an idea of the fact that you can both get bare ground and also a sense of the amount of vegetation you have, the structure of the vegetation, which is helpful for doing things like modeling fuel loads and that sort of thing. Okay, so you can see this image here is quite a bit better than what we were looking at in here. So for county parks, what we've had to work with between the 90s and up to about 2006 is this 10-meter elevation model. It's pretty coarse, and you can't get too much information from that. In 2006 was our first LiDAR run, and you can see that there's a definite improvement. We get a much better sense of what's happening on the landscape, but still not a lot of detail. There was another run in 2017, we got a product about the same. In 2019, we flew LiDAR again, but this time we were able to get quality level 1. That's a USGS quality level measure. And so this product has a vertical accuracy of at least 10 centimeters, a pulse spacing. So this laser's coming down at less than or equal to every 0.35 meters. And we can produce an elevation model of a 0.5 meter spatial resolution. So with this image here, you can see a lot more, and you can get a lot more information from the landscape. We can see road cuts. We can see where people, there's been excavation here. We can see where there's been infill, and we can learn a lot about the landscape before we even step foot onto it, right? So on top of learning about the landscape, we can also take this LiDAR product and add it into our everyday maps to make a better product for internally and both for the public as well. And so you can see in our guide maps from 2019, before we incorporated the LiDAR data, we have some trail mapping that needed some improvements. So you can compare number 1 over here to number 1 over here. Also down here along the Peterson Trail, you can see there have been improvements in the delineation of the trails. For number 2, we have the streams, and so you can see the stream running through here. Once we had the LiDAR data, we got a much better idea of where that stream actually was, and we were able to map it a lot better. And then our contours are much more detailed, so that when you're out in the parks and you're looking at which route you want to take, you can get a much better sense of the elevation gains that you might have to deal with on your hike. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is that despite the new products that we have for looking at the landscape, we still have to get out in the field and do plenty of GPS mapping and that sort of thing. But remote sensing is a nice way to avoid poison oak, thorns, ticks, and rattlesnakes. I think this is John out in the field in maybe like 2005, and he's mapping road cuts out at Almond and Quicksilver. When you see what the LiDAR data looks like in this area, you'll know that if he was to do this today, it would be sort of a monumentous waste of time because the LiDAR data just does so much for us. So with that, I'll let John take over.
Thanks. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. And what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the history of the Parks Department and how that defines the landscapes that we work within, that you get to recreate in, and how having a better understanding of the tools that we're using is also helping us interpret our landscapes again, based on new information to us. A lot of that history gets lost with time. And yet it's really important to understand the landscape, the county, who we were, it helps define who we are in some ways. And we'll go ahead and start here at Stevens Creek County Park in the Villa Maria area. And Villa Maria was a site developed by the Jesuits at Santa Clara University for development of products to use by the university and for the church. So they have, in the picture we're looking at, we can see two agricultural products, an orchard in the foreground, and on the hillsides in the background, you can see vineyards. And those are still visible. Some of the orchard trees still remain at the Villa Maria site. But in the vineyards, while they're largely gone, although occasionally you'll see remnant vines growing still, the terracing that was done is something that's evident on the ground. And over my 21 years at the County Parks Department, hiking around these parks, doing what we do, I see signs of terracing, signs of prior agricultural activity. And the LiDAR data really starts to open this up in a more global way. We have the experience that I have seeing these, but when you start looking at the data, you see how much more extensive this type of activity is throughout the lands owned by the department. And for those of you who have been in this program all day long, you've probably seen some of the trivia questions. One of them is the 28 parks, the 28 regional parks that the county operates. And we operate 52,000 acres of land that we started acquiring the first property in 1924 at Stevens Creek. And in that time, built up the park system, and they represent a real variety of landscapes, both from cultural practice as well as habitat types. So let's go to the next slide. So again, here we are, we can see the orchards, and you can see the geometry of the orchards. They're very ordered, and that's to maximize space. So you don't plant haphazardly necessarily, but that geometry that you plant them by is evident in the landscape. And we'll see some examples through the presentation today that will highlight that. The photograph on the left, you can see in the midground on the hilltop, there's actually trying to think of what the term is for it, but a sheltered structure where you can look out over the valley. And so there was a lot of development here. This wasn't just an agricultural field. There was a bit more going on. There were barns and a lot of structures at one time. So let's move on to the next picture. So here's the LiDAR data for the same site. And if we look at the image on the left, there's very little that you can pull out from that. You can see that there may be some uniformity in the landscape where the color is similar, the shade of gray is similar, and where you see changes in that, that's where you have some changes in topography. But you look to the right and it's dramatic, what you can see on the landscape. And on the main valley portion, just south of the red lines, you can actually see what appear to be ordered geometry, vertical lines running through the landscape. And then you look to the right of that, and you can actually see up into the hillsides, large road cuts and terracing, which is where the vineyards were located. And again, those are really still evident in the landscape, but the LiDAR data shows it to us in a way that we really couldn't see before to this extent. So it gives us an idea of the historic land use patterns. And at parks, that's really part of the story we want to tell. We of course want our users to go out and recreate, and we want to conserve landscapes, but we also want to know what landscapes have been previously disturbed and in what ways. What was the use, to both tell the history and also consider how we might consider restoration for habitat. So let's go to the next slide. So now I want to talk about Sanborn. Sanborn County Park, just a few miles south of Stevens Creek on the west side of the valley. Sanborn was settled in the 1860s, 1870s, started to pick up. A lot of French and Italian immigrants settled in this area. Most received land grants from the state of California, as well as other states that didn't have federal lands within them could grant property. So we're looking at Henry Purroy, who was part of the Purroy family who settled in this area in mid-1870s. And this property, we can see vineyards. And the family managed these vineyards manually by horse, and they didn't even use a wagon. They had to actually have a sled because the fields were so steep they couldn't put anything on wheels. So they used friction to kind of slow down what they were doing. And there's also orchards out here, as well as rock walls. To improve the agricultural fields, they would relocate the rocks, get them out of the fields, and build walls. And those walls were evident to me in my years of doing research out here at Sanborn and work developing a trail plan. So we'll take a look at some of those rock walls and other features on this landscape and how we can use historic imagery as well as old maps to understand the landscape as LiDAR shows it. So let's move on to the next slide. So here we are looking at the older LiDAR data versus the new data. And on the image on the right in the center, you can see a lot of linear features, very straight lines. Those are rock walls that are still evident on the landscape. And I've seen them, and we'll see some pictures of them in coming slides. But it's amazing how this LiDAR imagery really draws them out. And it aids us in trying to look at historic maps to understand former ownership patterns, who owned what. And again, we want to tell these stories. So they become really important as we're trying to interpret the landscape and tell those stories to the public. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So here we are in a zoomed in area to that the same rock walls, and you can actually see the lines of the former vineyards. There's linear features all through the landscape, and those vineyards haven't been managed for decades, 30, 40, 50 years. Yet they're still represented because they were active vineyard for nearly 100 years. With even during Prohibition, these vineyards were managed and the grapes were sold for home production of wine, which was, I didn't realize this until 10 years ago or so. During Prohibition, you could make up to 200 gallons of wine for personal use, which 200 gallons is quite a bit. So it's a little over 3 barrels. That would get most families by for a year without a problem. And so they kept operating throughout Prohibition, the Depression, and then ultimately this property was sold to county parks in 1990. The image below, the 2 horses, and you can see Henry Purroy again behind, they're doing some plow work, but to the below the horse's mouth on the right, you can actually see plantings for the vineyards and how they didn't build the vineyards on some type of a trellis. They actually just let the vines grow from the ground and so they really limited the amount of investment that was necessary to support the grapes. So they just kind of maybe a more traditional methodology. But that gives you an idea of the spacing and the geometry that we're looking for on the ground. So let's go to the next picture. So here we are. There's a picture of a rock wall, and that's the exact same rock wall in the Lidar imagery. And I took that picture of the rock wall in 2006 while doing some trail scouting in the area, and didn't realize that it was something that would be evident from a remotely sensed product. We just didn't have that type of technology at the time. You couldn't see something like this. To give a feel for what the 2006 data could show, maybe a road that was cut in a hillside that was 8 to 10 feet wide, that would be visible. But a smaller trail, maybe a 3-foot wide trail, wouldn't be. Now in the data, we can see a 3-foot wide trail very easily. So we're able to use that to correct our data. And GPS can be problematic in the trees that we find at Sanborn, Stevens Creek, and some of our other parks, the dense coniferous forests. The signal, it's much tougher for it to get through. The signal tends to get bounced a little bit, which reduces the accuracy of it. So let's go ahead and move on to the next. And here again, the same hillside, and these green dots on both images represent what to me represent the corners shown in this survey on the left. So trying to match those together and understand the landscape, and these surveys that were done beautifully. They're works of art, in my opinion. And trying to match those up onto the landscape, it's really beneficial. When I saw this LiDAR data for the first time, my jaw dropped. I realized immediately what we could use this for. And this is a great example, probably one of the best examples, but we're going to show you a few more. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is Lake Ranch at Sanborn, on the southern end of Sanborn off of Black Road. And in the picture in the bottom, you can see a barn, and behind it are vineyards, or what look like vineyards. I don't think they're orchards. And the LiDAR data to the top, you can see the rows. And I think in the foreground, in the middle, very middle of that LiDAR imagery, those could have more likely been vineyards. But up at the top, where there's a looping red dashed line, you can see little clumps. And I believe those are orchards. And I've been up on that hillside scouting for the trails that ultimately were built, the John Nicholas Trail, where we use some of the LiDAR data to find the old road beds that existed and utilize those rather than cutting new roads. So that limited the environmental impact. So it's not just that we use this for our interest, but we actually use it to try to reuse old roads that have been, created by former landowners, and minimize that impact on the landscape as much as we can. So let's go ahead and move on to the next. So we're going to go to Almaden Quicksilver. So hopefully you've all been to the parks I've been talking about. Almaden Quicksilver is another gem in our system. It's a former mercury mine, one of the largest in the world in its heyday, which it was a commercial operated facility from the 1840s and through the 1860s or 1960s into the early 1970s when the county purchased it. What we're looking at in the center of the screen here is the Mine Hill area of this massive mine complex. Our next slide is going to look at an area to the northwest of this called the Enriqueta. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So here we are, the Enriqueta and the Providencia, using the old data. And you can't really see much here. It's blurry lines. You need to zoom out quite a bit to see maybe this mountain range versus seeing this very localized area. A zoomed out perspective, this data was very useful. But to see the detail, we need to go to the next slide and look at the new LiDAR data. You can see the history of road cuts where there were old mine entrances or shafts. Those can be seen in these hillsides where you see little black dots. So there are entry points all over the landscape, way more than we can see right now because the vegetation is obscuring that. Back when Almaden Quicksilver was in full operation, you had 4,000 people lived on the top of this mountain in what's now Almaden Quicksilver County Park. Homes all over the place. The vegetation was largely removed. So let's move to the next slide. And this is Mine Hill. So you can see how little vegetation there is left. So we're on the southeast face of Mine Hill. And you can see a tunnel entrance right in the middle of the screen and lower middle. And this would be the location of Spanish Town. To the right, to the north would be English Camp. So if you're looking at the current guide maps, that would give you an idea of the two areas that we're talking about. And in the hilltop in the very center top is Mine Hill itself. And Mine Hill was the focal point of mining activity, although there was mining activity for 3 or 4 miles, kind of in all directions. As far as the Senator mine over by the Maccabee entrance to the park. And then you have the historic town down below to the east. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an aerial image of the same site. So 2021 aerial imagery. And you can still see some scars on the landscape, some modifications that are shown in the bottom center. We have the San Francisco shaft area. And that we took the old mercury waste rock the cinnabar that was left over and actually shoved it down the shaft to try to get it out of the landscape, return it back basically into the mountain. It's a naturally occurring mineral, but that mineral contains mercury, which can be problematic. But let's go to the next slide and let's see this from a LiDAR perspective. So completely different between the two. Like you look at this hill and you think, oh, there's a little bit of activity on the southern end. And then you look at the LiDAR and you realize this is a completely modified landscape full of shafts and tunnels and things that we've sealed up to protect the public, to keep you all safe and keep ourselves safe too, while we're out off trail doing our work. But the modifications on the landscape at Almaden Quicksilver, I've never been able to see a picture like this. And this LiDAR imagery is really showing, one, the potential for the technology. It might show us where we could consider future development, utilizing the existing road network that's out there. This gives you an idea of some of the other sites that are out there in the world where LiDAR data is being used to both discover and document historic sites, archaeological sites. Some great documentaries in the last 5 years about the use of LiDAR, both from a planimetric top-down perspective like this, but also using it for mapping purposes, to map the three-dimensional shape of buildings and archaeological sites. It's a remarkable technology that I think is just beginning to take off. and it's finding so many uses, and the density of these point clouds that are available now are really taking this in a direction that is very exciting to me, having been in this field for nearly 30 years. I'm really excited about where we're going, and excited to continue using products like this. So we'll continue to use this for our use in parks, trying to use it for planning and understanding the historic uses of the landscape. But I'm excited to see where we go in the next 5 or 10 years with the technology as a whole, and how we can adopt this for understanding where we've been and where we're going. I think it's a really exciting time. So with that, we're done with our presentation, and I'd like to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, hi, thank you, John and Seth. It looks like, we are right on time, but it looks like we just had one, so we might as well just, if that's okay with you, give it to you. It's the individual said, looks like, sorry, I missed it. Where does the Lidar data come from?
Do you want to handle that, Seth?
Where does it come from? Well, I can say that it was Sanborn, the company Sanborn, that was contracted to do the work. And then it's the county GIS team that has done a lot of the, I think, processing to make it available as to us. So if you work for the county, you would look to them. Otherwise, yeah, maybe send Yoko an email and she can talk about how it.
Yeah, I think that's one we could circle back on too,
Okay.
because this data is managed by the TSS GIS group.
Right.
We're utilizing it under this broader countywide contract the county had to pay for the data to be flown by a private company and processed. But the TSS group would be the sort of the authoritative source for managing the data and putting it out there for general use.
Sounds good. Thank you both. And additional questions, we're aggregating them all, so we'll get them to you and for people to get the response. So thank you, John and Seth. That was truly insightful. And that's actually all the time we have for today. So if anybody does have questions to previous speakers, you can still type them in the chat and we'll address them after the meeting. And I'll go ahead and share the link for presentation materials going forward. So, I really hope you've all enjoyed today's event, and that you too are inspired by what we can achieve through GIS technology and where it's taking us tomorrow. I know that the county GIS team and our incredible presenters truly enjoyed engaging all of you, and look forward to another robust GIS day next year. So our presentation materials will be posted on our website together with questions and answers within the next 3 weeks. We also will send you a survey to your registered email. And I would like to just please encourage all of you to fill out that survey for our future enhancement. Our aim is to, of course, give you the most robust GIS day every year that we can. So thank you, everyone, and see you next year. And thank you to all our presenters.